Medical records.
Conversation with Dr. John Foster.
Our guest today at the Iowa Falls Historical Society is Dr. John Foster. Why did you become a doctor?
I had compassion and ability. In those days, anyone could become a doctor. Most doctors were badly trained. Some became doctors by only reading books in a doctor's office.
Describe your training.
In 1853, I attended Rush Medical College in Chicago. It consisted of 4 lectures and demonstrations per day. At the end of the 4 months, I was a doctor. I had on-the-job training for the remaining 40 years of my life.
Describe your practice.
Healthcare was in the form of house calls. I covered a large area in the case of emergencies. I traveled on foot, by horseback, and by horse and wagon at all times of the year and in all weather conditions and all temperatures. I could only take medical tools with me that I could carry. There was no hospital in Iowa Falls during my lifetime.
What were the problems you saw?
Medical knowledge and sanitation were bad when I came to Iowa Falls in 1855. Child mortality was high. Nearly all of the large families in Iowa Falls lost children. As many as 1 in 3 died before age 5, regardless of family background. By comparison, this number has fallen to just 2% in 2021.
What were the common injuries of people in Iowa Falls?
Everyone worked, including children. Common injuries were from falls, on-the-job tools, farm machinery, and horses. Horses were very dangerous, but just like cars in modern times, they were necessary. There were also many railroad injuries. Railroads and farms were dangerous places in the United States. People were unfamiliar with the new tools and technologies. There were almost no safety devices of any kind at all. Adults and children were sometimes injured by runaway horse teams. Our know-how about treating severe injuries was improved by the American Civil War experience.
What were some diseases you saw?
Bacterial diseases of unsanitary conditions were common: cholera, diarrhea, and typhoid. People lived with consumption, tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, scarlet fever, measles, mumps and chickenpox. A very bad bacterial disease was diphtheria, which took the life of healthy young people. My sister-in-law, May Estes, died of diphtheria when she was a young woman. We had a smallpox vaccination, which prevented outbreaks and epidemics of smallpox, so smallpox was not a major problem in Iowa Falls. I always had my own pharmacy in Iowa Falls. We did not have antibiotics. Most of the medicines were to promote general good health and to reduce symptoms.
Why were you successful while other doctors failed?
A doctor needed to be a good nurse. I was a caring nurse, which required long nights away from my family. I was unconcerned about money. I took whatever a patient could afford to pay. I took payments in money, food, services, even in clean glass bottles.
This public newspaper article describes how Dr. Foster once amputated 3 fingers of a man who got his hand too close to a piece of power equipment on the farm.
My mother thought I was goofing off too much, so she got me a job at the local hospital, working in the central supply department at the hospital. So I did that starting my sophomore year at high school. And that's how I got interested in medicine. Because we used to, in those days, we sharpened needles and reused them. We cleaned syringes. We cleaned IV tubings. Everything was reused. There was no throwaway plastic stuff in those days. They hadn't come up with the disposable syringes or disposable needles or disposable IV tubing in those days. And part of my job was I hauled the oxygen tanks around to the patient's rooms, because in those days they didn't have piped in oxygen. You had to take a tank on a cart and wheel it to the patient's room to hook them up. I got very interested in medicine because of that, because of working at the hospital. There were 2 or 3 doctors in St. Joe, Missouri that had graduated from Creighton, and I was interested in that and in medicine, and I thought that would be a good place to go, so that's why I went to Creighton. It wasn't that expensive in those days. You know, I think a semester was only like $150 or something like that, you know, but so it was very reasonably priced. I lived in a dormitory, and well, I was 3 years in pre-med and 4 years in medical school. So I was there 7 years. In those days, you could get in after 3 years of pre-med, where now they have to take 4 years of pre-med to get into medical school.
Were you a good student?
Fair. I liked the biology sciences. I liked those. I took a lot of those, and I did very well in them because I liked them. I thought I wanted to be a specialist in OB and GYN, so I went to Dr. Goody had gone to Lafayette, Indiana, in a surgery residency, so I went there in an OB residency, and I was there for 5 months. I delivered a lot of babies, did a lot of circumcisions, had a lot of interesting cases, but they really weren't teaching me anything, and I was kind of getting bored. So that's when we decided that we'd go and practice.
That you and Dr. Goody would go in your... And
Dr. Dunley, the 3 of us. We all 3 got together and decided we'd like to find a small town with a small hospital and a place where we could practice. You know, when I started out, we had very few blood pressure medicines. You know, I can remember that the Diaril and chlorothiazide were the first big. When I was in training, when I was a student, we had a clinic at Creighton where we took care of people, and all we had in those days was phenobarb and mercurhydrin to treat high blood pressure. And then they invented Diaril, which is a hydrochlorothiazide type drug, and that was like a wonder drug because it really did help people with blood pressure problems. And of course, the only antibiotic we had when I started out was penicillin. You know, and then acromycin came along, and then some of the other then just it seemed like every year there was a new antibiotic that came along to help people. So those were the big changes: the treatment of high blood pressure and the treatment of infections.
But what goes through your mind when you think, "Oh man, I've got to save this child or this person because they're my neighbors"?
Well, you do. You feel bad for them that they got a problem. That's what the big thing is. But you have to treat them like any other patient. You have to you know, evaluate them and see what their problem is and treat them. That's all. You can't, you know, even if it was your brother or somebody else, you know, you can't sort them out. You have to treat them as if they're a regular patient. Yeah, I knew them before. I knew them in pre-med before we ever got into medical school. Dr. Dilley was from out in western Nebraska, and Dr. Goody was from Nebraska City, Nebraska. But I met them in Omaha at Creighton. We had a plan to go together. We all interned together. You know, we all went to medical school together. We graduated together, and we interned together in Kansas City. And we just decided while we were there that we all wanted to practice together, the three of us. And then we were looking for a small town with a small hospital, and my wife's father, well, we looked, you know, there were catalogs, and we looked at Knoxville, had a guy built a clinic building there for 3 doctors. We looked at that. There was also one in Decorah. My father-in-law was in a hospital in Fort Dodge, and a detail representative called on his doctor. And the detail man told his doctor that there was a doctor in Iowa Falls that was looking for some doctors to come in with him. And we didn't think much about Iowa Falls at that time, so we went to Knoxville, and the guy at Knoxville, the doctor at Knoxville, said, "I'd be delighted to have you guys come here, but I own the hospital, and you'd have to go take your patients 50 miles away if you wanted to practice here." And then we never got to Decorah, but Art Burgess kept calling me and calling me and calling me. So we thought, well, on our way to Decorah, we'll just stop here and say hello. And he gave us a tour of the town and took us to the Princess for supper. And we fell in love with Iowa Falls. And we brought our wives back a month later, and they thought it was great too.
In 1900, the John Cross will gave $3,000 for the establishment of a hospital. In 1901, J.H. Carleton sold residential property to the hospital for $4,500 and donated $1,500 more. In 1901, E.S. Ellsworth donated $14,000. In April 1902, Isaac Blackman Construction began the millwork. The first board were Farrington, Woods, Hogue, Weldon, and Jones. The hospital officially opened on September 25, 1902. In 1905, financial difficulties developed, so the hospital was leased to Doctors Morton, Pagelson, Garver, Chassell, Purcell, Burgess, Sams, Lewis, Hoyt, Mulnix, and Best. In 1907, there was an auxiliary fundraiser. In January 1908, the hospital closed for lack of funds. The hospital reopened in April of that year. There were 247 patients and 102 operations from May 1920 to May 1921. In 1935, there were bonds and a $42,000 grant. In 1935, Frank Foster also donated West Side property for a hospital, but was turned down. In 1936, a new building opened for $94,000. Doctors were Pagelson, Burgess, and Cole. In 1950, operating debt was $15,000. In 1964, the Maud Rep wing was added. In 1982, another new wing was added and the 1936 building was raised. In 1999, the Bert and Nettie Body new clinic was started. In 2014, the hospital was vacated for the new Hanson Family Hospital location, and the property became Ellsworth Estates.